With the dip in oil prices,
a shortage of foreign exchange,
and a steady decline in foreign exchange reserves, the need to diversify the Nigerian government's source of revenue beyond oil is more urgent than ever before.
On the show, Nigeria Going Beyond Oil, we bring you reports on the efforts of the Nigerian government to explore alternative sources of revenue as it de-emphasizes its historical reliance on oil. I'm Wale Famrewa.
And I'm Onyi Sunday. Join us as we explore this new strategy aimed at growing Nigeria's economy.
In our first report, I spoke to a range of experts about Nigeria's economic challenges and the evolution of non-oil revenues as a critical element in the government's revenue-raising initiatives going forward. Take a look. For decades, Nigeria has been an important oil producer, contributing over 2 million barrels a day of crude to global oil supply. The country's abundant oil resources have led many to classify the country as an oil economy. But is this classification justified? A deeper look at Nigeria's oil wealth compared to the country's population tells a different story.
When you look at oil per person, it's not. You look at the Gulf countries and they're exporting 300, 400, 500 barrels of oil per 1,000 people every day. Nigeria exports 12, not 300, not 400. And that 12 means that Nigeria will never be rich on the back of oil. It needs to diversify, it needs to broaden what it does.
The rebasing of Nigeria's GDP in 2014 revealed the diversity of economic activity in the country. The GDP data report for the first quarter of this year shows that the oil sector only accounts for 10.3% of GDP, compared to almost 90% for the non-oil economy, which includes 20.5% for agriculture, 21.5% for trade, and just under 12% for ICT. But the government's focus on oil over the last 4 decades has had a significant impact on government revenues.
In the early 70s, it used to be that 80% of government revenue was coming from non-oil, and only 20% were coming from oil. The problem became the fact that we took our eyes off everything else because it was easy money flowing from the ground. And then you fast forward to about 10, 15 years after that, and then it was the direct opposite. So oil revenue became 80%, non-oil became 20%. If you rely on a commodity that you cannot control the price, it's not a good thing for anybody. It's too much uncertainty. Because we have this very sharp decline in the price of crude oil over a very short period of time is the reason why we are today almost in a crisis situation that we have to address.
Indeed, the recent decline in oil prices has exposed structural weaknesses in Nigeria's economy and government revenues. Petroleum profit taxes due to the government are down 58% from 3.1 trillion naira in 2011 to 1.3 trillion in 2015. That number is expected to fall even further this year. Total government tax revenues over the period fell 19.2% to 3.7 trillion naira, but only because non-oil tax revenues rose 58% to 2.5 trillion.
At the federal government level alone, 3 trillion in the year. Now we're down to 820 billion. Even the 820 billion now, we have to pray and hope that we even reach that target. Because not only is price a challenge for crude oil, volume has gone down significantly.
I knew right from the outset that if we don't have the kind of situation that the crash in the crude oil prices had forced Nigeria to enter, we wouldn't take tax revenue generation or non-oil revenue generation seriously.
The informal sector is huge. According to the NBS, Nigeria Bureau of Statistics, so you have the largest, so it's almost 40% or more. And in terms of employment, over 20 million small businesses and organizations all over the place, employing 1, 2, 3 people. So it's huge. but the tax contribution is very low. In my estimation, I would say the tax contribution from the informal sector is under 2%.
Nigeria's current economic challenges have generated fresh calls for the government to lead efforts to reset the economy. Oil revenues are currently insufficient to meet the needs of the country's large population. It's time for Nigeria to fulfill the potential of the economy by driving the growth of the non-oil sector, as done by similar oil-producing countries.
When I look at countries that export as much oil per person as Nigeria, the country that strikes me as most interesting is Mexico. Mexico exports about 7 barrels per 1,000 people. Nigeria does about 12, far different from the hundreds that you see in the Gulf. And Mexico has managed to diversify. And it started in the 70s with oil and agriculture. And Nigeria should certainly be doing agriculture now in a bigger way. And President Buhari is trying to do that.
The Nigerian government's plan to reset the economy includes exploring the increased potential to raise taxes. It will also try to block leakages in the current tax system. It's a task made more difficult by a culture where the people expect to receive social services for free or at subsidized rates.
We had wallowed in a culture of entitlement. We had wallowed in a lot of ignorance around how public finance works. And the government has not helped that mentality by showing itself off as a government that can provide everything.
There have been a lot of talk as to who has the largest economy, whether it's South Africa or Nigeria. Now, if you compare their own tax position with Nigeria, I think they focused on it a bit earlier than we did. And so they're certainly ahead of us. If you look for figures, South Africa will be saying they're about maybe 21 or 22% tax revenue to GDP, while we are not up to 15.
You have over 37 million, small, medium enterprises that are operating in the Nigeria's business environment, and a significant number of them are not even registered with the tax authorities. Now, out of over 2 million companies that are registered at the CAC, we understand that only about 400,000 are probably registered with the FRS, and only less than 200,000 are paying their taxes regularly. You have a huge gap between what is potentially collectible and what is being collected.
Nigeria is a heavily import-dependent country. We import almost everything, from services to goods to even refined products. Now, you would then expect that on import duties and VAT on importation should be significant. We should not be talking about customs generating 800 billion, 900 billion in a year. That should be a tiny fraction of what they generate. Now, I think some of the issues we've had in the past that we're hoping that now will be addressed is the fact that on one hand we have some policy inconsistencies. Sometimes you see government will say we're giving waiver for this, waiver for that. That is not really driven by any macroeconomic policy or objectives. And one thing about people is they then abuse the process because there's something to gain from it.
A lot of organizations collected VAT from consumers without remitting same to governments. A lot of companies who were allowed to do what we call a self-assessment, present their own financials, presented wrong financials. And we're looking into all of that. So we're going to start comprehensive audits in certain sectors and make sure that we correct those leakages.
The drive to address revenue leakages and to expand the tax net is led by the Federal Inland Revenue Service. Early reviews of the efforts made so far have been mixed.
The progress we have seen is, first, we're seeing more engagement. And also we're seeing a government who wants to try and understand what the issues are, even though we also like for government to move more quickly. So it will mean that, because at the end of the day, people would only be able to pay taxes when they are successful. To become successful, a lot of that will have to be with support of government. Government has to create the right environment, the right framework. I know that we're always in a hurry, but these things take time. Tax awareness, tax education is very low in Nigeria. Even people who are highly educated They just don't know anything about tax, and most times they don't even care, right? So because of that, you find that if you compare Nigeria with other countries, say South Africa, say Kenya, say even Ghana there, let alone going to Europe, going to the US, we're very different in that sense that because of the little attention we pay to tax matter, that in itself leads to the fact that compliance rate is very low. And to some extent also, people justify this even though it's not a reason not to pay tax. People say they do not see taxpayers' money put into work.
There are so many people who are engaging in significant commercial transactions in this country that are not paying the right taxes. So there is need for the government and the FRS to pursue an accelerated expansion of the tax net. Some did not make it, I mean, they were not profitable between the first 3 or 5 years of their business. But right now, they are earning billions. And they are concerned that if they should disclose themselves to the tax authorities will want to collect significant penalties and interest, which in their own view could be huge or damage their business. So that is why we have also canvassed that government should look into a kind of specialized modified amnesty program for potentially taxable persons who find themselves not being compliant, not by reason of a deliberate attempt not to be compliant, not by reason of a design to avoid or evade taxes, but innocently.
The crash in oil prices has left Nigeria reeling under the pressure of a sharp drop in government oil revenues. But given the size and diversity of the economy, the government of Africa's most populated country has an enormous potential to raise non-oil revenues by improving tax collection and blocking leakages. The Federal Inland Revenue Service will play a key role in the process designed to get the country back on the path of growth and prosperity. The calls are loud and urgent. Kicking the can down the road will only make things worse. It's indeed time for Nigeria to move beyond oil.
Well, Wale, what are the key takeaways from that report?
Well, I do get the sense that it's on the front burner now, but we have a really long way to go. But the potential is huge. It's quite evident that so many people are out of the tax net in Nigeria. So many people need to get into that tax net. And once the government finds a way to make that happen, it's really incredible the impact that tax revenues can have on the government's fiscal situation. As we know, the oil price decline has really exposed Nigeria significantly. We'll find out whether or not they're able to achieve that.
Interesting, Wale. Well, Nigeria going beyond oil returns shortly. Do stay with us.
Welcome back. If you just joined us, you're watching Nigeria Going Beyond Oil. Earlier in the program, we highlighted the potential and opportunities for the government to generate revenues from the country's non-oil sector.
Now, true, boosting revenue through taxation is one of such opportunities. It is known to be a major instrument of economic growth for funding the government's budget. Well, Wale spoke to the man leading efforts to raise tax revenues, the executive chairman of the Federal Inland Revenue Service, Babatunde Fowler.
Give us a sense of the evolution of tax revenues in Nigeria over the years.
Before 1973, when we used to have the groundnut pyramids, and we used to have the cocoa plantations, we had a lot of taxes from that sector. Thereafter, with the oil boom, the country and the people relied on oil. And so, of course, up until 2 years ago, the petroleum sector accounted for 80% of taxes, 90% of foreign exchange earned, and all the other sectors were sort of left abandoned. And we became a trading nation where we imported everything from toothpicks to matches, to whatever you can think of. And so the industrial base that should have promoted employment and also accounted for tax revenue almost disappeared.
But have tax revenues grown in line with economic growth?
Well, in terms of when the oil price was going up, tax revenue went up because the taxes on petroleum products. And they accounted for the majority in terms of the area of growth. But as the oil price went down, so you're looking at a situation whereby in 2011, we received about 3 trillion in oil revenues in terms of taxes. Now in 2016, we're budgeting under 800 billion, so that gives you an idea of the impact of tax revenue from one sector, which is oil.
Where would you say we've had the most inefficiency in terms of tax collection?
Tax administration basically is the responsibility of the state boards of internal revenue and also the Federal Inland Revenue Service. And so if those agencies are not efficient, regardless of the sector that seems to be booming, revenue won't grow. Like for example, apart from maybe NNPC and other government controlled sectors, we had a lot of companies in the oil and gas sector that didn't file returns, didn't pay taxes. So although you could experience an oil boom, you could experience a lot of activity and growth in the sector, if the tax administration for that sector is not efficient, then you will see equal growth.
Can you compare Nigeria's economic growth with tax revenue growth in the informal sector?
Well, let me try and answer that very carefully so people understand. Because of the type of political setup we have a revenue board at the center, which is the federal government, and each state has its own revenue board. So depending on the importance or the efficiency level of the tax administration board, either at the federal or the state, will also impact on how much revenue is collected. If I look at Lagos, for example, and we have a lot of people in the informal sector within the tax net. We grew the market or the tax net from about 224,000 to about 4.5 million. Now, out of that 4.5 million, maybe about 500,000 come from what we call the organized private sector and also government agencies. The other 4 million are from, in quote, the informal sector.
Can you compare Nigeria's foreign trade growth with the collection of tariff?
Well, also Nigeria has a peculiar situation in that during the last administration, a lot of waivers were given, tax waivers were given. So although at that point in time, a lot should have come from customs, but because of the waivers, that was reduced. And then if you also think back, even under the military, when they had some economic policies that had to do with the importation of vehicles, and what simply happened was that everyone imported their car next door to Cotonou and then drove it through the bush or through the border. And so we created a situation whereby our neighbor made so much revenue from duty on vehicles that were for use in Nigeria.
So what is the FIRS trying to do to change the situation? Can you share with us your growth targets?
Well, in terms of growth, we have a very challenging and ambitious target. We intend to grow well over 30% from last year. Some people might say, well, the economy is not as buoyant as it used to be. But we say that if we're more efficient and the taxpayers cooperate with us, then we'll meet that target.
The Executive Chairman of the Federal Inland Revenue Service, Babatunde Fowler, talking us through issues around Nigeria's tax system.
Indeed. Now, taxing Nigeria's informal sector, which accounts for almost 60% of economic activity, topped discussions at Nigeria's biggest tax conference this year. Onye brings you the highlights of the event.
At the 18th Annual Tax Conference, fiscal challenges and opportunities of Nigeria's economy are brought to the fore. The conference affords government and tax professionals an opportunity to meet and discuss emerging issues in taxation and the profession.
The conference theme is indeed relevant and timely, as it is coming barely a week after the assent to the 2016 budget, which is the fulcrum of an ambitious strategy to reset the Nigerian economy. The Nigerian economy's challenges are both well documented and extensively analysed. Whilst the current oil price is low, it is instructive to note that even when the oil prices reached historic highs of as much as $115 a barrel, Nigeria did not significantly benefit in terms of economic growth. This can largely be attributed to a number of factors, which include, but are not limited to, corruption, wastage, and inefficient spending, as well as revenue leakage. Oil revenue was an effective anesthetic that obscured the effects of fundamental weaknesses in our public financial management, which we must now address.
Statistics from Nigeria's Federal Inland Revenue Service show that with a population of over 160 million people, there are only 10 million registered taxpayers in the country. This highlights the country's over-reliance on revenue from its oil sector, which contributes just 17% to the country's GDP, while overlooking the potentials in the country's non-oil sector.
The theme has a clear intention of focusing on the present economic situation and apprise its fundamental challenges and opportunities for a tax system. The huge gap between tax collections and the quantum left uncollected year after year needs to be addressed if the nation must make meaningful and sustainable progress in the face of huge infrastructural gap she's currently faced with.
It's acclaimed globally that taxation is an instrument of economic growth for funding the government's budget. Ensuring the same tool applies in Nigeria's economy tops discussions, with a focus on taxing Nigeria's informal sector.
Now, when we look at Nigeria, the informal sector is said to constitute or be responsible for 58% of our GDP. And I've just given you a foundation as to where we are in terms of taxation of that sector. It is largely non-compliant. Why would some states not be interested in the informal sector? Number one, cost of collection is usually high when compared to tax yield. That is a general belief that if you chase 100 people in the informal sector and you make 1 million naira, why waste your time? You might as well chase one big fish who will pay you the same amount and with less stress. Well, that is not totally true. You'll find out that as you bring them into the tax net and as they develop their business and they start to pay more taxes, once you've caught them and got them in that net, you actually don't have to chase them anymore.
The informal sector comprises mainly small and medium businesses. Often regarded as low-income earners, they are key drivers of any economy. Taxing this group, however, is no walk in the park. The executive chairman of the Federal Inland Revenue Service, Babatunde Fowler, shares his experience while in office as the executive chairman of the Lagos State Board of Internal Revenue Service.
Now, for those who believe that it imposes a burden on the low-income group, I'll give you a typical example. We did give awards to mechanics in Lagos. And the thing that surprised me is that when I went to their office then, the road in front of their office had potholes in it, but they were still consistent in paying their taxes. And they're very glad to tell us that their children went to school, free school provided by Lagos State. So they appreciate what the state was doing. And I think that is the rider that we have to take away from here. It is not a burden. They are pleased to pay a little bit on their income as long as they receive services from the government in the place where they reside.
Enforcement, no doubt, has an important role to play in ensuring compliance. Some, however, believe education must precede enforcement.
Before you start to enforce, you first of all have to tell people what you are trying to enforce. You have to give them an opportunity to comply. You have to take steps to make it easy to comply. Enforcement really should only apply to those who do not want to play ball. Unfortunately, very often we think that we just flash and say you're supposed to pay your tax. You haven't paid your tax. Now we're going to come and enforce. There's a whole series of steps that need to take place.
Having now taken steps as tax administrators to educate, to inform, to ensure that we engage them, and to even encourage them to understand their responsibilities, what they should do and what they should not do. Then even after saying all this, and now they now know their rights and duties and their obligations to the government. I mean, if after all said and done, such people or such person has chosen not to be a good citizen, then the next thing to do is to carry out an enforcement of the law, which is part of the tax administration process.
In the end, it all boils down to implementation of resolutions made at the conference, be it increasing IGR by taxing the informal sector, making tax payments easier, adopting a presumptive tax regime in the informal space, or reviewing Nigeria's tax laws, amongst others, all in a bid to diversify Nigeria's source of revenue.
You know, it's really interesting to hear about all the elements that need to really come together, the educational aspect, and of course just the focus on the informal sector from that very enlightening path that you put out there.
And then, of course, education topping the list. It is something that must be pursued at this point in time. Well, Nigeria sure does have a lot of ground to cover in boosting its internally generated revenue. Is it doable? Of course it is.
I think so too. On that note, we come to the end of the first edition of Nigeria Going Beyond Oil, an informative program designed to take you through Nigeria's journey to achieving economic prosperity beyond oil. I'm Wale Famrewa.
And I'm Onyi Sunday. See you again next time, and thanks for watching.